Someone's mother spent time around Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. Not at a premiere, not at some industry event where everyone performs. Actual time. And she came home with a verdict no publicist would have approved. Jerry Lewis was rude and impatient, and no fun to be around. Dean Martin was the opposite. Warm, generous, easy. Everything Lewis pretended to be when the cameras rolled. That gap between who a celebrity was on screen and who they were at the kitchen table runs through every story in old Hollywood, like a crack in a foundation. And one of Hollywood's most famous love affairs, the one between Loretta Young and Clark Gable, wasn't a love affair at all. By Young's own account, it was an assault the studios covered up so thoroughly that the child born from it spent most of her life not knowing the truth about her own father. Old Hollywood scandals have been packaged for decades as gossip, juicy tidbits, harmless behind-the-scenes color. They're crime scenes. The victims are mostly children, and the studio system made sure you'd hear affair instead of assault, and secret adoption instead of what it actually was, a mother hiding a child born from rape. From the 1920s through the 1960s, the major studios held actors under contracts that functioned closer to indentures than employment agreements. MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, each one ran its own machinery of image control. Publicists like MGM's Howard Strickling built entire careers on making inconvenient truths disappear. Eddie Mannix, the notorious fixer, could suppress a police report before the ink dried. Gossip columnists Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper played both accomplice and executioner, choosing which secrets to bury and which to weaponize based on whose interests aligned with theirs that week. The architecture was so total, so normalized, that audiences accepted the sanitized versions without a second thought. They wanted mythology. Hollywood delivered, and mythology required victims to stay invisible. Morality clauses in studio contracts gave executives extraordinary leverage over their performers' lives. An actress who got pregnant outside marriage, an actor whose private behavior contradicted his public persona, either could have their career destroyed overnight by the very studio that had manufactured them. These clauses weren't just about morality. They were instruments of control, giving the studios legal authority to enforce silence on anyone whose personal life threatened the profitability of the brand. When something truly damaging happened, an assault, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, the fixers didn't just clean up the mess. They rewrote the story from scratch, creating fictions so polished and so consistently repeated that they became the accepted historical record for generations. Especially when the damage landed on children. While some stars shielded their kids from public exposure, others exploited them as publicity props, or worse. Historical accounts document a pattern of psychological pressure so intense that in some cases, it contributed to suicide. Children of old Hollywood occupied a uniquely cruel position, close enough to fame to be permanently marked by it, powerless enough to be reshaped by it, voiceless enough that their testimonies, when they finally arrived decades later, were routinely dismissed as bitterness or betrayal. A star's child who spoke up was never treated as a witness. They were treated as ungrateful. Jerry Lewis stepped into this system on July 25, 1946, when he and Dean Martin debuted their comedy partnership at the 500 Club in Atlantic City. One Italian smooth and effortlessly cool, the other a rubber-faced dynamo of manic physical comedy. Together they stumbled into a chemistry so electric it defined American entertainment for a decade. 16 films in 10 years, an astonishing output that made both men wealthy and famous beyond any reasonable expectation. Their split came exactly 10 years to the day after their debut, July 25, 1956, one of the most public breakups in show business history. What followed for Lewis was a solo career that cemented his image as America's most generous comedian. He hosted the Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon every Labor Day weekend, weeping on camera, begging the nation to help my kids. That phrase, my kids, takes on a savage irony once you learn what Jerry Lewis did to his actual children. Martin and Lewis didn't speak for nearly 20 years after the split, a silence broken in 1976 when Frank Sinatra arranged a surprise reunion during Lewis's Labor Day telethon, live television so emotionally charged that both men appeared visibly shaken on camera. The public loved it. They saw two old friends finding their way back to each other. They didn't see what people around both men had always known, that Martin's warmth was genuine and Lewis's was performance. Archival accounts and the testimony of those who worked closely with Lewis paint a portrait strikingly consistent across multiple sources and decades. He was increasingly dictatorial, a king of the hill figure who demanded deference from everyone in his orbit. Nobody who spent real time with him confused the man for the persona. The man who made the entire world laugh couldn't make his own family feel like they mattered. Lewis married Patty Palmer in 1944. Together they had 6 sons: Gary, Ronald, Scott, Christopher, Anthony, and Joseph. He adopted a daughter, Susan. For a while, the family maintained the expected image: large, boisterous, materially blessed by the patriarch's enormous success. But as Lewis's career evolved and his need for control expanded into every corner of his life, the fissures became impossible to cover. Colleagues described him as someone who demanded total authority over everyone around him, a man whose idea of collaboration was obedience. He divorced Patty Palmer in 1980, married Sandy Pitnick in 1983, and in 1992, at the age of 66, he and Pitnick adopted a daughter named Danielle. To his first family, the message landed like a door slamming shut. He'd started over, built a replacement family, and left the original behind. Rather than merely walking away, Lewis had created a visual replacement, a new domestic tableau that allowed him to keep performing the role of devoted father without any of the complicated, accusatory faces from the first attempt looking on. His daughter later described the experience in language stripped of dramatic flourish. To be abandoned is heartbreaking. The sentence doesn't accuse, doesn't rage. It names the wound with a directness that reveals how long the speaker has been carrying it. A man who spent every Labor Day weekend weeping on national television for children he called his own, while his actual children waited for a phone call that never came. But Lewis's particular cruelty existed within a much larger pattern. To see that pattern at its most violent, you have to go back to 1935, to the snowy wilderness of Mount Baker, Washington, where a 22-year-old actress named Loretta Young was filming Call of the Wild alongside Clark Gable. The official story, the one that persisted in Hollywood lore for nearly 60 years, framed what happened between them as a passionate fling, born of isolation and proximity. Audiences who've looked closer have been blunt about the correction. The first one was date rape, not a fling. Others describe the child who resulted as born from a non-consensual R-word situation. They're right, and the language matters, because the words you use determine whether you see a victim or a willing participant. What happened on that production, reportedly on a train during the shoot, was, by Loretta Young's own eventual acknowledgement, forced. She didn't consent. She was 22, Catholic, unmarried, and utterly without recourse in a system designed to protect men like Gable and the studios that profited from them. Young became pregnant. In an era when an out-of-wedlock pregnancy could annihilate a career, and when the truth behind this particular pregnancy would have been catastrophically damaging to the studio's most bankable male star, Young vanished from public view. Health reasons, the publicists announced. She gave birth to a daughter, Judy, in 1935. And then, in a scheme whose cruelty deepens with each retelling, Young placed her own biological child in an orphanage and subsequently adopted her. A legal fiction choreographed to explain the child's presence without acknowledging that Young was the birth mother, and certainly without acknowledging who the father was or how the child had been conceived. Studio publicists, fixers, the compliant gossip press all played their assigned roles. The approved story became Loretta Young, generous Catholic actress, adopted a little girl. How charitable, how sweet, how completely, viciously false. The machinery that enabled this deception was the same apparatus that protected every powerful man in the industry. Howard Strickland's publicity office at MGM didn't just manage positive press. It actively killed stories that threatened studio revenue. When a star's behavior endangered the brand, the fixers moved fast, suppressing police reports, hiding pregnancies, relabeling assaults as romances. Loretta Young's pregnancy didn't just disappear on its own. It was disappeared, methodically, by professionals whose entire job was making sure the public never connected the dots between a young actress's sudden absence from the screen and a baby's sudden appearance in her home months later. Judy Lewis grew up inside a lie so comprehensive it had been stitched into every detail of her daily life. She didn't know Clark Gable was her father. She didn't know the circumstances of her conception. What she knew, from the time she was old enough to register her mother's reactions, was that something about her own face caused Loretta Young visible distress. To hide Judy's resemblance to Gable, particularly his distinctive large ears, which the child had inherited, Young forced the girl to wear bonnets whenever she was photographed. Constant, non-negotiable, and not enough. When Judy was 7 years old, Loretta Young arranged for her to undergo ear-pinning surgery. Judy asked to wait until she was older. Her mother refused. A 7-year-old girl was put under anesthesia and had her ears surgically altered so she would look less like a man she didn't know was her father, to protect a secret she didn't know existed, to hide a truth about her own origin that she wouldn't learn for decades. A mother so traumatized by what had been done to her, so terrorized by the studio system's demands for silence, carved the cover-up into her own daughter's body. Judy grew up navigating unexplained anxieties and watching her mother recoil from certain angles of her daughter's face. Long before the surgery, long before she understood any of it, she documented this journey in her 1994 memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, a title whose bitter irony speaks for itself, since the uncommon knowledge in question was the most basic fact of her existence: who her father was and what had been done to her mother. When the truth finally came, Judy had to reconcile a lifetime of confusion with the realization that an entire industry had conspired to keep the facts of her birth from her. Loretta Young, in her final years, made statements that came closer to acknowledging what Gable had done on that train, though the explicit, unhedged language that accurately describes the encounter remained, even at the end, something the system had trained everyone to avoid. The vocabulary of cover-up outlasted the studio system itself. Lewis's method of erasure was different from Young's. He didn't need fixers or orphanage schemes or surgical interventions. His method was quieter and, in its own way, equally permanent. As his solo career reached its zenith in the 1960s and 1970s, the dictatorial persona that colleagues described became the defining reality of his household. His need to be the center of every room left no emotional oxygen for the people around him. His sons grew up in the shadow of a man who was simultaneously everywhere, on television, on movie screens, on the telethon stage, and nowhere that mattered to them. The divorce from Patty Palmer in 1980 formalized what had already been true in practice. Jerry Lewis had chosen his public over his private, his audience over his family. Young used the machinery of the studio to hide the fact that a crime had produced a child. Lewis used the machinery of celebrity, the telethon, the public persona, the audience's willingness to believe what they saw on screen, to hide the fact that he'd discarded his own children. Both cases left the children holding the weight of a deception they didn't create. Meanwhile, Margarita Carmen Cancino, the woman the studios rebuilt into Rita Hayworth through painful electrolysis sessions to raise her hairline and skin lightening treatments, was being consumed by the mythology the studio had constructed around her. Rita Hayworth had endured childhood sexual abuse, a foundational trauma the studio system had zero interest in acknowledging. Harry Cohn, head of Columbia Pictures, exercised predatory control over her career and reportedly over her person. She married 5 times. Each marriage replayed variations on the same dynamic: men who wanted to possess the image without caring for the woman inside it. "Every man I knew went to bed with Gilda and woke up with me," Hayworth reportedly said, a single sentence that captures the fundamental cruelty of being consumed by your own mythology. Her daughter, Yasmin Aga Khan, was born December 28, 1949, to Hayworth and Prince Ali Khan. The marriage was supposed to be the fairy tale, the Hollywood goddess and the actual prince. It disintegrated rapidly, and during the divorce proceedings, Yasmin became the target of multiple death threats, placing a small child at the center of an international custody battle that carried real possibility of violence. When Ali Khan offered $1 million in exchange for Hayworth agreeing to raise Yasmin as a Muslim, Hayworth refused without hesitation. It was one of the few moments in her life where she exercised unambiguous personal agency, and she exercised it for her child, choosing Yasmin's autonomy over a fortune. A woman the press had spent years reducing to a pinup proved herself to be precisely the mother the industry had never given her credit for being. Years later, as Hayworth deteriorated from Alzheimer's disease, initially misdiagnosed, mislabeled by the press as alcoholism, Yasmin channeled her grief and anger into action. She became a highly visible advocate for Alzheimer's research, working through the Alzheimer's Association to raise funds and public awareness, turning the wreckage Hollywood had made of her mother's life into something that actually helped people. She inherited not fame, but the aftermath, and she carried it with more dignity than the industry that created it ever deserved. Jerry Lewis faced none of what Rita Hayworth faced. No one was trying to take his children. No custody battle forced his hand. Nobody offered him $1 million to surrender them. He walked away voluntarily. The telethon raised billions over the decades. His children raised themselves. When Lewis died on August 20th, 2017, at 91, his will confirmed what his first family had already known. He disinherited them. Every single one of them. The final, formal, legally binding expression of the abandonment he'd been practicing since the 1980s. A man who had raised billions for other people's children left his own with nothing. Not because he didn't have it, but because giving it would have meant acknowledging they existed, and acknowledging they existed would have meant confronting what he'd done. Lewis wasn't the only one whose private behavior contradicted his public warmth. The pattern was industry-wide, and the system protected all of them. Not all of these accounts went unchallenged, and where the record is genuinely split, saying so matters. Gary Crosby published Going My Own Way in 1983, alleging that his father Bing Crosby had subjected him and his brothers to brutal physical abuse, belt beatings, emotional cruelty, psychological control that left deep and lasting scars. Gary described a household ruled by fear, where the genial crooner the world adored became, behind closed doors, a man whose discipline crossed into violence. The fates of Bing's 4 sons from his first marriage to Dixie Lee lend the allegations a grim weight that's difficult to dismiss. Lindsay Crosby died by suicide in 1989. Dennis Crosby died by suicide in 1991. Gary himself died in 1995. 2 of 4 sons killing themselves within 2 years of each other. That's not a coincidence that resolves itself neatly. But Bing's second wife, Catherine Crosby, and their children, Harry, Mary, and Nathaniel, have consistently denied the abuse allegations. Mary Crosby publicly defended her father, describing a man entirely different from the one Gary wrote about. 2 families, 2 completely different versions of the same man. Both versions come from people who were there. Both deserve to be heard. The temptation is to pick the version that confirms whatever you already believe, but the honest position is harder. We don't know the complete truth, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. Certainty was a luxury the children of Hollywood rarely got. Joan Crawford's legacy carries the same fracture line. Christina Crawford published Mommy Dearest in 1978, alleging physical abuse, psychological torment, and a home life governed by rage and obsessive control. Wire hangers, midnight rages, a mother whose love felt indistinguishable from punishment. Her brother Christopher generally supported her account, corroborating elements of the abuse Christina described. But the twins, Kathy and Cindy Crawford, publicly denied Christina's version and defended Joan, insisting that their experience of their mother bore no resemblance to what Mommy Dearest depicted. Joan Crawford herself, in her will, disinherited Christina and Christopher with a single devastating line, for reasons which are well known to them. Crawford's own traumatic childhood, growing up in poverty, enduring sexual abuse, fighting her way into Hollywood from nothing, doesn't excuse what Christina described, but it illuminates how cycles of damage perpetuate themselves across generations like a genetic inheritance nobody asked for. Whether the abuse happened exactly as Mommy Dearest portrayed it, or was shaped by decades of resentment and competing memories, the Crawford children's lives were defined by their mother's fame and the public war over truth that followed. Their inheritance, like so many children of Hollywood, was the argument itself. A family's most painful private moments turned into a book and a camp movie, consumed by millions of strangers who would never have to live with the consequences of picking a side. Raymond Burr's story cuts in a different direction entirely. He spent decades as one of the most beloved actors on American television. Perry Mason, Ironside, characters the public associated with justice, integrity, and moral clarity. Behind that career, Burr maintained an elaborate fictional backstory that included a deceased wife and a son who had died of leukemia. None of it was true. Burr was gay. He lived in a committed relationship with Robert Benavides for over 30 years, a partnership defined by genuine love, mutual respect, and the kind of quiet domestic happiness that most people would consider unremarkable if it weren't for the fact that an entire industry had made it impossible to acknowledge. Burr fabricated the dead wife and the dead child because the Hollywood of his era gave him no other option. The same system that rebranded assault as romance also made it unthinkable for a gay man to simply live his life honestly. So he invented grief to explain away the absence of a wife, constructed a tragedy to justify why he never remarried, and kept the real love of his life hidden in plain sight for 3 decades. Benavides was his partner, his companion on the private island where they built a home, grew orchids, and tended a vineyard. Burr's talent was enormous. His Perry Mason remains one of the most iconic performances in television history, and his charitable contributions were substantial and genuine. He was, as audiences today have said, a phenomenal actor who should be remembered fondly. He earned that reputation honestly. The system that forced him to lie about who he loved didn't diminish what he built. It just made the building harder and lonelier than it ever needed to be. Patty Duke won an Academy Award at 16 for The Miracle Worker. She suffered from bipolar disorder that went undiagnosed for years. And during that time, her personal life careened through relationships marked by chaos and confusion. Her son, Sean Astin, grew up not knowing which man was actually his father. Duke told him different men at different times: Desi Arnaz Jr., John Astin, who raised him, and Michael Tell. A DNA test eventually confirmed Michael Tell as Sean's biological father. Duke's autobiography, Call Me Anna, documented the turbulence of her life with unflinching honesty, including the toll her untreated illness took on the people closest to her, especially her children. Sean Astin could have chosen bitterness. Given what he grew up with, the uncertainty about his own identity, the instability of a household shaped by untreated mental illness, a mother whose love was real, but whose capacity to express it consistently was compromised by a disease nobody had yet named, nobody would have blamed him. He chose grace instead. John Astin, who wasn't his biological father, stepped into the role of steady, reliable parent and stayed there through all of it, providing the kind of consistency that Sean's biological circumstances had made nearly impossible. His orientation toward his mother has been described as a testament to understanding that people are hopelessly human, a phrase that doesn't excuse the damage, but refuses to reduce a complicated, suffering woman to her worst moments. Where Judy Lewis's memoir documented the psychic cost of deception, and Jerry Lewis's daughter's testimony named the wound of abandonment, Sean Astin's response to his own chaotic origin story documented something harder and ultimately more valuable: the possibility that a child of Hollywood could absorb everything the system threw at them and still come out the other side without being destroyed by it. Forgiveness that doesn't require pretending the pain wasn't real. That's the rarest thing in any of these stories, and it cost more than bitterness ever would have. Decades ago, the contract system collapsed. Eddie Mannix and his fellow fixers died off, while columnists like Luella and Hedda eventually lost their grip on the industry as the studio system collapsed in stages across the second half of the 20th century. But the lies they told are still the default versions of most of these stories. Loretta Young and Clark Gable's love affair still gets called that in plenty of places. Jerry Lewis is still remembered primarily as the man who cried for his kids on the telethon. Rita Hayworth is still a pinup before she's a person. Raymond Burr's fabricated dead wife still shows up in biographies that should know better. The children always knew the real versions. Judy Lewis knew something was wrong every time her mother adjusted that bonnet. Jerry Lewis's daughter knew what abandonment felt like long before she found the words for it. Yasmin Aga Khan knew her mother was more than Gilda, more than a magazine cover, more than the mythology that consumed her. Sean Astin knew his mother's illness didn't erase her love, and that understanding her meant accepting the full weight of who she actually was, rather than who the press said she should have been. They carried these truths for decades, while the public consumed the studio-approved fictions without question. Calling assault what it's, naming the children who were abandoned or born from violence, honoring the ones like Raymond Burr who built entire lives of love and decency behind walls the system forced them to construct, isn't gossip. It's a correction that's decades overdue. The mythology was comfortable. The truth is better. And the children who lived inside these stories deserve to have someone finally tell it straight. Subscribe for more stories like this.